Next, a few words from another man at the top, a man who's long been associated with IPSE, who now sits at its head. He's IPSE's new chairman, James Collins.
Can I just say how grateful IPSE are to the Prime Minister for taking the time to make that address. It's encouraging to hear he believes the government has a clear role in supporting the self-employed community. Hello everyone and welcome. The self-employed now represent 14% of the UK's workforce. This is an astonishing figure. It adds up to 4.6 million people. You are the key policymakers and industry representatives for small businesses and the self-employed across the United Kingdom. Thank you all for being here. We have a superb day in store for you with an array of fantastic speakers and debates that will tackle the key issues facing micro businesses and the self-employed. So why did IPSE decide to hold this first policy conference now? Because the way we work is changing. Almost 5 million people are self-employed, and they bring billions to the UK economy, and that number is growing. We need the country to recognise this. Many are now making the decision to work for themselves, and why not? From being your own boss to having that better work-life balance, the benefits certainly outweigh the challenges. We rebranded a couple of years ago with the aim to cater for and support the wider world of self-employment. By doing so, we developed our understanding and knowledge of the sector and the many strands and industries within it. We are now the largest organisation in the EU that represents independent professionals and the self-employed. That's why it's now time to hold our first policy conference and ask, how can we enhance the enormous contribution the self-employed make to the UK economy? We need to show just how big an impact this way of working has on our economy and the way people lead their lives today. We also believe that as the influence of the self-employed has grown, so has the influence of IPSE. In the last year, we've seen a number of IPSE policy recommendations taken up by the government. We will soon see the introduction of the UK Small Business Commissioner, which IPSE called for in its manifesto and recently came to fruition in the Enterprise Bill. With the Commissioner, small businesses now have an independent body to help resolve their disputes, which are often around late payment. What the government now has to do is to appoint the right person as that Commissioner. IPSE's call for a review into self-employment was taken up by the government and led by one of our guest speakers, Julie Dean, and we're delighted she is joining us here today. It was great to see her review adopt so many of IPSE's policy recommendations, from fair maternity pay and flexible pension solutions to better education on self-employment for young people, and for advice and support to be more readily available. There are a lot of really innovative ideas in this review, and we will be pushing the government to ensure that it moves them forward. We'd like to see all of the report's recommendations acted upon. So Julie, on behalf of IPSE, a big thank you for all your hard work, and I think we should all applaud her for that. I'm also pleased the Minister for Small Business, Anna Soubry, and her Labour counterpart, Bill Esterson, will be addressing us later. Make no mistake, IPSE listens to our members and the voices of self-employed workers up and down the country. And just as importantly, the government listens to IPSE. When I was appointed as chairman last year, I vowed to support and protect the UK's freelancers and seek further opportunities to build and grow the influence of IPSE as a leading business organisation. This conference is part of that, and I know there is so much ambition and scope for IPSE to do even more. As the self-employed go from strength to strength, we want to continue working and building closer relationships with you all. Let's make this community let's make sure this community continues to be well represented in business, in the halls of Parliament, and in the devolved administrations. We're also working with the press and the media so that they fully understand how people want to work in the 21st century. This conference is a truly significant occasion, and I urge you to get as much as you can from today. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Intuit Quickbooks. And now I'll pass you back to Sue. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, James. Feel free to tweet about the event during the course of the day. You can see it here, actually. Hashtag IPSE PC16. That's IPSE in caps, PC lowercase 16. Hashtag IPSE PC16. And you'll be able to see live tweeting on the screen here, so you can help us get trending if you can do a bit of that. So there's time too today for networking. We want you to enjoy this day and to make it work for you. So we've got lots of people here, as you've heard, delegates, people from government, from oppositions, plural, business leaders and so on, academia. You can get talking to them, whether it's during coffee or during the lunch hour, and make the day work for you. And there'll be plenty of opportunity to make your voice heard. We do want to hear from you. We've got microphones on the floor, so as we talk to our various experts here and panels, we want you to get involved and you to put some questions. So please don't sit on your hands or hide behind your tweets. Put your hands up and let's have some questions. Okay. Let's get going. First off, down to the important matter of tax. It can't be ignored, it can't be sidelined, it can't be fudged, as David Cameron and Jeremy Corbyn found out to their cost. It all comes out in the end, whether you put it through the BVI or Barclays. Too often, of course, we, the self-employed, have possibly been wrongly accused of being disguised employees. It used to happen to me. Again, perhaps because one didn't fit neatly into an HMRC box, they would often ask me, the taxman would often ask me, if I worked predominantly for the BBC, why wasn't I employed by the BBC? And my honest answer was that actually I wanted to work for other organisations as well, which I always have. Well, I was always treated with some suspicion, to be honest, but on the other hand, it seems to have got a bit better. Things have changed, HMRC has adapted, but has it adapted enough? IPSE thinks there are still a few things that could be done, if not quite a few things. Let's explore that territory of tax and the self-employed with a group of experts. So can I invite onto the stage, in this order, please, sitting from that end, Adrian Dixon from the HMRC. He's been a tax inspector. Does he admit this at dinner parties, I wonder? He's been in the business for 30 years. These days he leads an expert team on employment status, travel and subsistence relief, and the construction industry scheme. Then there's John Whiting, who thankfully is from the Office of Tax Simplification. We may be needing you, John. He was a partner at PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers. He has experience in the Chartered Institute of Taxation and is a non-exec director of HMRC. Then there's Anita Monteith, to sit in the middle, if you would, Anita. She's from the Institute of Chartered Accountants. She has a special interest in tax matters affecting small and medium-sized businesses, and she understands all about the developments in online filing, which is going to affect us all. She is leading her organisation on the government's proposals to make tax digital, MTD, which we will have under the microscope today. Then there's Chris Sanger, who is from the global financial advisors Ernst & Young, where he is global head of tax policy. He has an extensive experience of advising governments across the world and was also for some years head of business tax policy at the Treasury. And finally, John Midgley. John Midgley is a senior manager at Intuit Quickbooks, makers of the accounting software and, as you've heard, sponsors of this conference. So there's a powerhouse of fiscal grey matter arrayed before you. Let's see if we can put them on the spot. We thought we might take our subject in 3 sections. And the first section, we've got, as I say, microphones on the floor. Where are the girls? Oh, there you are, at the back. Thank you very much. The question here is the tax system suitable for modern ways of working? Let's debate that for 10 minutes or so. Anita Monteith, do you think the system is flexible enough to work for the kinds of people who are in this room today?
I think one of the problems we have with a flexible system is that there are too many choices, and choices in the tax system, obviously they're not always up to, I'd like to just choose to pay a low rate of tax, but choice leads to complexity. And I think that is the biggest problem that self-employment leads to. We have so many different rates of tax, we have so many cliff edges, we have things you can deduct. Now we're adding in, obviously, digitisation, we'll come to that later. I think choice is a problem, complexity.
John Whiting, Office of Tax Simplification, you were nodding. You agree with that?
Basically, yes. I mean, choice, it's a very important point Anita makes, and it's something we've highlighted a few times. The system is built often on choices. Choices do bring complexity, they bring confusion, they bring very often the need for advice and just an awful lot of time spent sorting out. And probably the greatest demand we've found as we've gone around talking to people, be they freelancers, small businesses, individuals, is certainty. That's what people want. They want to know where they are. And one of the problems with the current system of tax is that it doesn't give as much certainty as would ideally be the case. You mustn't forget that it's still a good system for a large number of people who are employees, for a good number of what one might term traditional self-employed. The problem is, as represented here, the growing numbers of people who don't fit into those categories. The freelancers, the people, almost the biggest, fastest growing sector, people who do 2 or more jobs, who do self-employed, employed. And the impact of the new economy, the gig, the Uberization, the TaskRabbit, all of this is putting the tax system under increasing strain because people don't fit into these convenient categories that it's built on.
Which in turn puts the taxpayer under increasing strain. You say we need advice. Advice costs money.
Oh,
that's
absolutely.
Exactly what, if you're self-employed, you can't actually afford to do.
I mean, what is our goal as the OTS? Answer to get a simpler system, and simpler means things that people can just cope with and do. It's a long-term goal. I don't
Adrian
see
Dixon,
us solving
do you hear the pleas here?
I've spoken with John often enough and read all his reports and listened to IPSE members and read them often enough to agree entirely. Even looking around and at the IPSE membership, and now you've got the self-employed added onto the PCG as it was, there's a huge difference in the self-employed to freelancer contractor market. So we don't, as John said, just have employed, self-employed, but we also have difficulty in defining them. I can say I'm a self-employed builder, and it's easy to say that. I know what it looks like. Well, what is a contractor? What is a freelancer? And the advantage of 2 different choices we have now is it does give a different structure, which is slightly complex, that the grey areas at the margins, but it means that different taxation rates, for instance, can be applied to different types of workers. If you have a simple structure, which is possibly one structure for all, then you're going to have to level up or level down the rates of taxation and national insurance contributions. So simplicity can come at a cost to one part of the workforce.
Simplicity isn't simple, basically.
Simplicity never seems to be simple.
Have we got any questions from the floor? Would someone like to put a question on this? There's a gentleman. Here we are. Sir.
My name is Michel Cyrus. I'm a jobbing freelancer. I'll actually be on one of the panels this afternoon. But one of the combinations that I've recently experienced as a freelancer is the combination of being a jobbing sole trader with being the director of a company. A line of my business required me to leave myself open to some legal actions potentially, and to protect myself, I formed a limited company on a discrete area of my business, and it was a nightmare for me, frankly, because the accountancy fees doubled, and the amount of, against the amount that I was earning with the company, it was intended, as I say, as a protection for my legal position. made it totally inappropriate and difficult, and in the end I abandoned the whole idea.
So
And
what would have made it easier?
I think
for you?
a much more streamlined tax system, because you were talking earlier, Sue, about not fitting into boxes. And I think this is the difficulty. People want, I think the tax system and banks as well, want people in discrete boxes so that they can be sold to and supported in the right way. But people like myself, you know, for a whole variety of reasons, cut across those boxes, and the tax system simply doesn't facilitate that.
Chris Sanger, is there any way in which you can see all of these problems accommodated?
Well, I guess the first question is, should you accommodate the problems? I mean, we had the question before that actually, if we had a single tax system that applied to everybody and the same rate and everything like that, then you wouldn't actually be accommodating anything. So you'd have a very simple application. But simplicity is on one end and you've got fairness on another, and it is a spectrum. As you add more complexity, you can get to a fairer system, provided that people understand it. I mean, I do think there is a case to be made for taking that more radical view of what we have right now and going back to something that is a cleaner understanding of actually what we want to achieve from our income tax and national insurance tax systems.
Like what? What do you mean by that?
Well, at the moment we get 45% of our total taxes come from income tax and national insurance, and a lot of that comes from, as John was saying, those that are under the PAYE systems. What you could do is you could create a cleaner system that provided similar allowances for many people, but kept you at a same kind of rate, and you deal with the income tax and NICS distinctions that we have. And I think the OTS report that talks about aligning income tax and NICS is a good step forward to actually driving some of the differences that we have between the systems out. If we are going to remain in a system where we try to get different systems for different people, we have to accept we've got complexity, and that's going to give the tyranny of choice.
John Whiting, can you rapidly
A couple
react
of
to that?
points. I mean, the simplicity fairness argument is an absolutely key one. Simplicity and fairness do tend to pull against each other, that you either have simple or you get fair. And if you want it to be fair because you want an allowance here and a tweak there, it makes it more complex.
Sure.
There's one very important override, which is, of course, that the system cannot be fair if people can't understand it and can't manage it, because it's just got too complex. The other thing I'll just come back to, the gentleman makes a very interesting point about business structures. It's one thing, another of our reports on small companies we picked up and we're doing a bit more work on. You know, at the moment, you have the choice, sole trader or limited company. Interesting thought, is there a need for a slightly different vehicle, which we've christened sole enterprise protected asset, which is
say that again.
sole enterprise protected asset, SEPA for short. It's modelled to a degree on the French system where they have EIRL, and I can't remember what that stands for. So.
You're getting the thumbs up from my question.
The scenario is that you are a sole trader, but you can register to protect some of your assets. So you don't have to form a limited company. You would just say, I want to be a sole trader, but I'm going to act as a SEPA, and that means my house cannot be taken. It's something we're doing a bit more work on. Look out for a paper in the summer which will test whether it's a viable idea.
I'm going to get a bit of reaction to that, but I'd just like to bring in John Midgley and say, what do you think? Maybe we should just... This sounds rather rude, doesn't it? Maybe we should just rip it all up and start again, John.
Well, I'm potentially not going to advocate for that. But I was just going to add a data point to what John was saying around the sort of the impact of technology and the changing workforce. So we've put out a study in the US that we think by 2020 about 40% of the US workforce will be freelancers. And that has a huge impact upon, the way that, and, you can well imagine similar numbers in the UK. And that's going to have a huge impact upon lots and lots of people trying to work their way through the tax system, but also actually on HMRC. And it's kind of the other half of this story, not least about when HMRC is able to get the money in, because it doesn't have, it doesn't have the reliability of that, that cash flowing in through pay as you earn.
Okay, I'm going to take a quick bit of reaction because then I want to go to a vote on a very radical question, the one I just put to John Midgley. I'm coming to you, Adrian, but Anita just wanted a quick point and then you can react to the whole thing.
Yes, it was just in response to the OTS proposal for another form of entity. I mean, you will have gathered from my first statement that I'm very nervous about having more sorts of things. And
Because that's more complexity.
It's
I
more
completely agree,
complexity,
Anita. It's
yeah.
one of the things we've got to test. Is it worth it?
yes,
Yeah.
and people ask anyway, if you're trading with somebody who has put themselves into a limited company to protect their assets, quite often they ask for personal guarantees anyway. So it doesn't work. And I've seen so many people wind up in a company who really shouldn't be there because they can't handle the admin and the complexity of it. And then they can't get out again.
But that's the test. Would the SEPA idea mean they don't go into a company in the first place? But we'll
Adrian
explore.
Dixon, are you hearing anything that you find attractive?
I think in response to the gentleman's point is it's worth noting that he formed his limited company not for tax purposes. So tax isn't the only driver which creates some of the complexities. People do go into limited companies now for the protection of the liability, and because engagers are driving them in there because some people don't want employees because of the cost associated with that.
I actually formed it to protect my assets.
As John says, so there's a lot of merit in John's argument there, but as Anita says, we've seen that in other areas of the taxation system is if the liability transfers to somebody else, they will seek a guarantee from the person who's going to put them in a difficult position. But recognising, as we all do, I think, is that it's not working as it should do because the 21st century labour market, which is what I'm interested in, be it self-employed or employed or this stuff in the middle, is very different from the 19th century.
So something must be done.
So we are increasingly having tensions, and we have to recognise that.
Okay. Right, I'm going to put a quick question to you now. Can you get those keypads that you're probably sitting on them at the moment, but anyway. This is a very serious question. Stand by to press 1 for yes or 2 for no. Here's the question. Would you support an entire rewrite of the tax system for small businesses? Press A or 1 for yes, B or 2 for no. We've got the responses ticking through up the top there. 66 responses so far. Some people obviously ducking out. Can we get a response? Polling closed. 69 responses. 68% want a complete rewrite of the system for small businesses. I think that Adrian Dixon has heard us. Let's move on because we've got more voting.
All right, we've just got our job for the next 5 years.
Okay, we're moving on to the budget now, and how did it affect independent professionals and the self-employed? Well, we got a lifetime ISA, which is a good thing, can help us save for retirement, and we got confirmation, as the Prime Minister was saying, that Class 2 NIC contributions will be scrapped. We like. What are we more worried about? We're worried about MTD, making tax digital. The government want all tax accounts to move online and returns to be filled, wait for it, every quarter. That could be a nightmare. More admin, more costs, as we've just been discussing, more deadlines, more potential penalty charges. John Whiting, what do you think of this one?
Going digital has to be the way forward. Automation, make use of the power that's there. I'm sure that everybody in this room uses technology, whether it's QuickBooks or something else. They're used to that.
Products are available.
There are other things, are there? Okay. But so that as a direction of travel has to be right, to get to automate, to link things, all that sort of thing. The question is how far and how fast, of course. And to pick you up on one thing, Sue, I mean, you mentioned and it is a valid concern, this idea of quarterly reporting. Is it going to be quarterly returns? Well, we know that's not the idea of full return every quarter, but of course what it is, it's still up for discussion and debate. The idea is you're going to update your data with HMRC every quarter. Adrian can no doubt say more. And if this is all automated, if it saves a lot of hassle at the year end, sounds like a pretty good answer. But there's a big if, there's a big but in there as to, as I say, how quickly we have to get to this. Underneath it all, there's a requirement potentially to keep all records electronically. What is that going to mean? Is it going to mean no spreadsheets? or whatever. There's a long way to go to get there, but as I say, to me, as a direction of travel, it's the right direction. My concern is speed and compulsion.
Chris Sanger of Ernst & Young, do you see it working?
Well, I agree with John. This is a question of when, not if. I mean, we are going to move into a making tax digital type of world where everything's filed. I think the real challenge, though, is what are you actually filing and what information are you providing? If the government is basically saying, which I understand, is that they will use their powers to get a whole load of information that that they have on you and to pre-populate items like from your bank accounts and all other items, such that then you're looking at something where actually they've done all the work of gathering and you're just saying, yeah, that looks reasonable, that looks right.
But it would be very big brother, the idea that the government could have direct digital access to your bank accounts. I mean, we keep those to ourselves. We don't even show our accountant our bank accounts.
They already do. I think in terms of the information that is now is available in the banks, in terms of the interest that comes in, there's a lot of information out there. I think what the Making Tax Digital is trying to do. They don't have direct access to our bank accounts. They can have access to all of that kind of information. But they have to go through all kinds of hoops to get that. But if the idea of a Making Tax Digital world would be that effectively you can pre-populate your tax return.
What does that mean? So basically,
that means that the numbers in your tax return are filled in for you. So rather than you having to go down to the effort of trying to work out all the various different accounts you've got and how it all fits together, the idea of this is the government has done that for you. They've created the right answer for your tax return, and you're saying, is it complete, does it make sense?
But they can only do that if you told them absolutely everything about yourself.
So I think, if I may, I think there's two visions. There's one, as I understand it, at least on the personal taxation side, which is very much to what Chris was describing, and then on the sort of small business, self-employed side, again, as I understand it, the idea is that many more self-employed people and small businesses will be using technology to manage their finances, and that HMRC will allow that technology, that software, like our own, to speak seamlessly to the HMRC digital tax account. And that means that these quarterly reports will be more of, hey, it's time to send in some information to HMRC, it's all here, as opposed to something where you have to sit down for many, many hours and days preparing a return to send off.
Anybody want to comment on this from the audience? Yes, gentleman here.
Hello, I'm Jason Kitcat from Crunch Accounting. We provide software similar to yours, sir. I think this is a no-brainer, and I think there have been some people causing a fuss on this in a bit of a snobbish manner, saying, oh, well, your plumber or your builder wouldn't be able to do this. Well, I think they would. We already have hundreds, and people submit a quarterly VAT return online. They do a monthly RTI on the payroll, and it's just a click of a button. So I think we need to challenge HMRC that they're going to have their systems in place to work properly, but ultimately this will simplify, and there are many Scandinavian countries where you get a text message at the end of the tax year saying, is this right? And if you don't reply, your tax return's done. And that's what we should be aiming for, and we should be supporting the tax man in getting digital rather than trying to fight him.
Anybody want to disagree with that? No, they're all going to fall into... Oh, here we are.
Hello, I'm David Kirk. I'm an accountant who deals with, especially in the intermediary sector. I really can see problems here, and I think accountancy fees are going to rocket. To my benefit and to the detriment of most other people in this room. The problem is doing it quarterly. A simply fantastic number of contractors keep their records on spreadsheets now. It is actually very simple to do a VAT return on the, I forgot what it's called, the one where you only declare the sales, which may only have 3 entries in a quarter.
Yes.
And not all the purchases, which have about 150. Likewise, the RTI return is probably done by your accountant anyway. And I'm talking about IT contractors here, people who are very IT savvy. A huge number keep their figures on spreadsheets, and that is going to have to change with this, I suspect.
So there, I think, is the rub of it. So I completely agree. I think this is something that we should be embracing. But I think it's up to us in the software community to demonstrate to small businesses and the self-employed why they should move on from spreadsheets. And the challenge is on us, I think, to provide, in advance of this change, to be providing great solutions into the market that accountants, small businesses and the self-employed want to use.
Do you think it's a bit like changing from a BlackBerry to an iPhone? You know, you're terrified, but once you've done it, you're glad you have.
Well, one would hope so.
We don't know if the Prime Minister's changed from his BlackBerry yet, do we? Anybody else from the floor? Same gentleman again, here.
I seem to be the jobbing freelancer case study here, but basically, from my point of view, the problem, as the gentleman has just said, is accountancy bills. It's not the facility with which one does it. Just to give you an example, in my case, my tax affairs as a sole trader are quite simple. I send my accountant the invoices and I send him the details of my overheads, and he makes the calculation and pays the tax, for which he charges me 1 day's work at £550. If I've got to quadruple that, my overheads are extraordinarily high. So if we're going to move forward in this way, there has to be a way for jobbing freelancers like myself to be able to submit returns without having to constantly use accountants, because otherwise, as the gentleman says, accountancy bills are just going to rocket.
It's the problem. Adrian Dixon, what are you thinking of everything you're hearing?
I've heard it. I think it's all fair enough, and I'm surprised nobody's been more sceptical about our ability to deliver the IT, which is welcome change, I must admit. But we are in a tax system which is still based on the notion of the 19th century, where you have ledgers and you have paper, and people still deliver their carrier bags worth of records to their accountant at the end of the year. So 18 months after that transaction took place, somebody provides a receipt, enters something on a return, or they've got their spreadsheet, they take it off the spreadsheet and put it on our return. What we want is a seamless interaction, as has been said, between the software you use and HMRC. So there is no sort of difficulty of saying, I've put it over here, I now have to put it on HMRC's return. Quarterly gives you the ability to do things more in real time. It gives you the ability to correct things in real time. You don't lose invoices. And it gives you insight to what payments are due, what payments have been made across all the heads of duty, VAT, tax, if you've got pay-as-you-earn and employees. So for lots of people it will be beneficial, and lots of people do keep monthly management accounts. For some it will be a change. The 850,000 subcontractors, many of them earning less than £30,000, about 600,000, won't be using spreadsheets. They will have carrier bags worth of records. But there are advantages to them. If we can get their deductions populated into their account, they can make sure that they can see what tax has been deducted and accounted for. So there are ups and downs for everybody on this.
We're slightly pressed for time, but I want to ask Andy Chamberlain, who's one of IPSE's tax experts, what he thinks about MTD and whether he thinks it's inevitable and right, or whether he's got severe concerns.
Inevitable, it probably is, as Chris said, it probably is a question of when, not if. I think our concern, it does go back to, as John said at the beginning, it's sort of how fast. It does feel quite fast. We're talking about some people will be affected by this by 2018. So, and it will be mandatory. And I think we will probably press to have a longer period where it's voluntary, to let people ease into it for a bit longer, to see how that goes. That would be our preference. But yeah.
It's going to be acceptable as long as it comes a bit more slowly. Just while we're in this section, and I'm worried about time, as I say, we ought to briefly mention, and ever so briefly, IR35, Anita. I mentioned earlier on about disguised employee in my introduction. It's changing now for contractors in the public sector, isn't it? Can you just explain that?
Yes, in the public sector, the proposal is that the engager, so BBC, local government, whoever is the engager nearest to the individual will have to decide whether IR35 applies. So the burden has shifted. There are going to be difficulties with that. It is probably fair to say they are in a better position to gather the information they need than we have at the moment with the individual having to make the decision. But I do wonder a little bit if this isn't just testing, toe in the water, to see if it does work that way around.
Well, you mean it could
better.
then go on into the private sector?
Possibly spread to the private sector
just
as
so
well.
everybody understands, I mean, as I understand it, if I'm a PR and I do a job for my local council, then that local council would decide how much tax should be paid.
They will assess whether you are more correctly treated as an employee than using the normal self-employment
for that period
rules,
of time.
for that particular contract.
So it effectively makes me, as the PR, into an employee, doesn't it?
Not for worker status, so you don't suddenly get employment rights. What I'm really worried about...
Well, that's the problem. You get all the downside, none of the upside.
Well, what I'm really worried about is that the amounts that people get paid at the, so that the PA in that particular case, whether going down the chain, whether effectively the employer's national insurance doesn't end up getting deducted from the PA.
Adrian Dixon, quick one on this. It's only a matter of time before that's going to apply to the public sector moves into the private sector, isn't it?
No, there are no plans to extend to the private sector.
That's what politicians always... There are no plans. It means nothing to us.
The public sector has an obligation to ensure the fair operation of the tax system, and therefore we think it right that it should be applied in determining the IR35 status. Looking at the employer, secondary NICs, employer NICs, I mean, the principle for those who don't know is that if, for instance, we were paying Anita £2,000 for this job, we'd knock off the VAT, knock off the 5%, which you have as the expenses deduction in IR35 now, to get a net figure, which I suppose one would call wages in heavily inverted commas, and then the local council would apply the employer's NICs to that, so that would be an expense for them on top of it, Anita. So what you're saying, I suppose, is that that would depress the price by 13.8%.
Exactly, you just pay less.
Let's have just an interim vote, because we're going to come to a third section, and I think some of these issues will still be covered in that. But here's your vote. Keypads, please. Is the government right to pursue its making tax digital agenda? 1 or A for yes, and B for no. Vote now. And they're coming in. We've got 65, 66, 67. That's it, I think. 67. Let's close the polls and get an answer on that one. 68. Just nipped in. Right. It is. Well, isn't that interesting? People are genuinely in favour of MTD. That's terrific. What a modern audience you are. Okay, third section. Would independent professionals and the self-employed be prepared to pay more tax in return for something we were mentioning earlier, certainty and a simpler system? Well, what do we mean by that? We mean, as we've been saying, we want certainty in our tax affairs. When IPSE surveyed its membership last year, more than half the membership, 52%, said they'd be prepared to pay more tax for more certainty. Chris Sanger, IPSE and your company, Ernst & Young, are proposing a new structure, I think, called Freelancer Limited Company. Can you explain how that would work?
Yeah, I mean, this comes back to the previous comments when we started all of this, that actually what we want is a system of certainty, and actually being able to give certainty to freelancers that they are in a particular system, this is how they're going to be taxed, I think is worth a huge amount of at least sleep to people when they're trying to go to sleep at the end of a day. I mean, I think the essence of the FLC is trying to say, well, okay, if we look at all the activity that HMRC has been focusing on the sector on IR35, if we look at how it's applied to the freelancers, generally the members of IPSE and others, actually most of those is a wasted time, both on behalf of the freelancer and of HMRC, because at the end of all the inquiries, they don't fall within the IR35 rules. But there is a huge amount of work that goes into getting that. And that's where the FLC comes in. The FLC is designed to be a group which may not capture all of the membership of IPSE, but maybe 80%, 90% of the membership, for whom it's easy to show that these people really are not likely to be at risk of IR35. And therefore, there are constraints on whether you can be within the freelancer limited company or not, and it puts some constraints on what you can do when you're in there. So, for example, it might be a single shareholder only. in that kind of environment. And and you may have a limit on the number of dividends you can pay, or there are various different options that are out there for discussion. But the idea is you effectively create a group of freelancers for whom they have all the characteristics, which if HMRC were looking at it from a risk perspective, they say, actually, this is not the kind of audience we need to go after. These are not the ones who are likely to be at risk of IR35. And it comes back to almost the Making Tax Digital point, that if you're going to go down a system of trying to make people do tax returns or responses on a quarterly basis, you need to have a simpler system. Mm-hmm. And the whole essence of the FLC is it allows those people who are within that group to basically opt into something that has some constraints but gives them a simple, easy to understand outcome and allows us to move forward.
Does that appeal, Anita?
Well, I come back to what I said before. I don't like having more options. We've seen something a bit like this being mooted in the last couple of years, where we had the business entity tests published. I sat on a forum as they were being discussed, and we had many, many hours of debate about exactly what these tests should be. And I suspect you would need something like that if you were to go with Chris's idea of a company. So, for instance, how many days were you allowed to work for the same person? Do you take your own tools? All the things we're familiar with already. I think the problem with Chris's idea will be determining who's eligible for it and who isn't.
John Whiting, you were asking for more certainty. I mean, does this not offer it?
I think this has merit. I mean, it came up when we were looking at employment status a couple of years ago, and the initial outline, frankly, wasn't very good. So we sort of pushed back, and to their credit, IPSE, with EY's input, have sort of responded with what I think is really quite a promising design. And the point is, of course, it's not a new vehicle as such. It is a limited company, but with some restrictions on it. The challenge is, of course, can you write those rules carefully such that it's easy to see if you're in or not? And, of course, one of the consequences is, back to your original question, Sue, people would end up paying a bit more tax, a bit more to get that certainty. And it's certainly a message we've heard regularly that people will pay more. I mean, to take national insurance, we found really quite a big call from self-employed professionals to have, believe it or not, their national insurance bills the same as the employee national insurance, park employers. The quid pro quo is, of course, they get the sort of equivalent benefits about sickness, about possibly unemployment.
It's the age-old problem.
Yes, it's evening up.
But you know what I think underlines it all, really, is that there seems always to have been, and I hinted at it in my introduction, a kind of perception on the part of government, HMRC, that somehow self-employed people are tax avoiders. And that's the issue, really. And, how long is it going to be as our numbers grow and grow, before you stop seeing us as that and see us as, pretty decent contributors, Adrian?
I was a tax inspector, and therefore a long time ago did actually investigate self-employed people and companies and employed people. I don't think it's right to say that we have a perception that the self-employed are tax avoiders. I think we have a perception that there are a number of structures which can be used to minimise or mitigate legitimately a tax liability by disguising yourself as one thing or another. And it's not just self-employed people, it's, for instance, we won the UBS case recently in Deutsche Bank. It was highly paid bankers who are hiding behind employee benefit trusts. So there are lots of people mitigating their tax bills. We don't necessarily just look at a self-employed or an independent contractor within a personal service company and say, tax dodger. That's not our view. They're legitimate vehicles to manage your affairs. And as the gentleman over there said, he went into a personal service company to protect his assets. That's what they're there for. That's why they go into liability companies. But I think should contractors pay more, we come back to the fairness thing, which is what should anybody pay? What is the right level of tax? Are contractors getting the beneficial rate? Are they getting the right return from the state, perhaps, for what they pay? So it's a fairness argument as well as should they pay more to get certainty.
John Midgley.
Yeah, I'd just offer the perspective that I think there may well be a lot of merit to the proposal. I think, in addition, though, there are just huge dividends from great adoption of technology that can get to this kind of certainty for an awful lot of businesses. And if we can get people out of the shoebox full of receipts and the Excel spreadsheets into software in the cloud that's pulling together all the data that they need, that's going to have tremendous benefits.
I think they're converted on that. You saw their vote.
Yeah.
About 86%. I think, it's a done deal, really, by the sound of it. Adrian Dixon, you didn't react to the freelance limited company idea from Chris Sanger.
We're actively engaging with IPSE and Chris knows, on my side, the personal tax side and the business tax side, to look at the FLC. There are merits in it, but there is an argument that if it's too easy to get into it, then people who shouldn't be in it, to give them the certainty, will utilise it to mitigate tax on the
I'm just going to take a point from the floor here. Down, just on your left here. That's it. Thank you.
I'm David Jackson. My company is Hudson Contracts, and I work in the construction sector. I currently contract the service that's provided by 32,000 freelancers working on building sites all over the country this week. Now, they enjoy what they think is a fair tax system, and it's the CIS tax system. And on every payment they receive, 20% is deducted, sent to the revenue on a monthly basis. So that aspect of fairness is not in doubt. Every construction worker will tell you that that is a good system for them. My problem is that there is this forever conflict of conferring that freelance self-employed status on those particular workers, because the challenge comes, and it's predominantly from the revenue, are you really disguised employees? So I would suggest that at some risk, perhaps, freelancers in other sectors don't have too much to fear from a tax deduction system that taxes at source, provided it is as fair in the sector that it is seen to be as fair as in construction, provided the starting point is the acceptance of self-employment status. What does the panel think of that view?
Chris Sanger, what do you think of that?
Well, I think the CIS has grown up over time and hasn't always been as easy or as popular as has been disclosed just now. But I think the nature of all of these things, and coming back to Anita's point, I don't actually have a problem with providing choice to people on how they should act, provided that they can easily see the choice that's in front of them and understand what the options are. So what the FLC is trying to do, saying if you want to constrain your actions, then actually you can fall into the FLC, and then you know what your future is going to be. And a bit like we've seen with the construction industry as the thing has developed, that's got to a system which everybody has understood and they know how it works. And I think if we can get that bit right, then we can end up with a much simpler system based on the type of contractor that you are.
Anita, I'm going to take a quick reaction from you.
Can I just challenge a little on the construction industry scheme? Great, people know how it works, but there are 1/3 billion unreconciled amounts collected every year in the construction industry scheme. Everybody kind of nods and says, yes, that's fine, because probably most of it is people who have done a little bit of work here and then pushed off back to Europe, and nobody's going to chase them because it's sort of the right sort of amount of tax, and, that will do. But I don't think an approximation of tax, CIS just deals with a bit of a problem, but it's not a precise science.
John, quick comment before we go to Adrian.
The approximation is an issue, but as a principle, I think this has quite a lot of merit, and it's something we suggested it was worth looking at, to widen out, not quite CIS writ large, but again, you come back to it. If you're an employee, dead easy, PAYE. If you're clearly self-employed, okay. Is there merit in expanding that deduction scheme and sort of saying that, 15%, 20% should be taken off people, and when you're not certain of the status, may have all those unreconciled problems,